Thank you. It's an honor to be here. I'd like to thank our hosts for their lovely hospitality. And so I've been tasked with the presentation of divine human communication in Judaism. And I basically going to read the paper that I sent, so you can follow along. All right, so it's about a half hour presentation. So the history of Judaism is really predicated, and as indeed are all the other two traditions we're going to hear about today, predicated on the idea of divine human communication. Well, the idea of this communication has remained central over the millennia. It has also witnessed massive recalibrations, all the way from its origins in animal sacrifice in ancient Israel, to intellectual conjunction in medieval philosophy, to contemporary religious Zionism that sanctifies the land of Israel as the only place where Jews can maintain this communication. It's pretty much everything in between. I think it's important to imagine the history of Judaism as the history of this communication, and more importantly, the interpretation and reinterpretation of this communication throughout the generations. And I thought the best way to do this, to sort of as a segue into this rather massive topic, would be to tease out the idea of divine human communication by putting opposites in counterpoint with one another. So sacrifice, prophecy, Ibn Ezra, Judah Halevi, Maimonides, Kabbalah, Reform Judaism, and Orthodoxy. So before we get at those, just a few basic considerations. I think the first is, and I think we've probably seen this in some of the conversations today, is that Judaism is often referred to as an Orthoprax religion. I have problems with Orthoprax, Orthodox, etc. But this means that it is predicated more on performance and less on belief. That's not to say that belief is unimportant, but there's no salvific formula or creed, as in Christianity and Islam, for example. Traditionally, God communicates to humans through revelation of the commandments, and humans in turn communicate with God through their performance of those commandments. It is also important to note, and I think this will have important repercussions, is that Judaism, unlike both Christianity and Islam, is not a universal religion, as I said yesterday, something that may be witnessed in its very small numbers, both in the past and in the present. This has many consequences. It means, for one thing, that Jews are rarely interested in proselytizing the contents of their communication to non-Jews. It also means that because Jew, quote unquote, can be constructed as both a religious and ethnic signifier, such particularism, at least in certain circles, can give way to xenophobia predicated on the religious language of this communication. Now, within this context, one could argue that there exist two diametrically opposed forces within Judaism, as I talked about yesterday, the universal and the particular, that are constantly at odds with one another. And that's why I've decided to use binaries to try to open up the concept of communication. The universal in Judaism is that force which looks outward and seeks to connect the tradition to the larger religious, social, and intellectual contexts in which Jews found themselves. We see this most closely, for example, in the rationalist strand of Judaism, wherein Jewish philosophers sought to define the essence of Judaism using the terms of Neoplatonism, Aristotelianism, Kantianism, and so on. At the other end of the spectrum sits the particularistic, that which, as the name suggests, emphasizes the particular and uniqueness of Judaism, thereby seeking to cordon off the tradition from outside influence. Finally, it should go without saying that since there is no way to prove such communication has even existed, after all of us here only possess subsequent textual accounts written by one side of the relationship. So humans are telling us what they say to God. God's not telling us what he says to them. This means that we must also attune ourselves to the political and ideological implications of what it means for a religious actor to lay claim to such communication. Claims of divine human contact, after all, have created some of the wonderful works of the three religious traditions, but they have also been used to justify and legitimate sexism, misogyny, xenophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and a host of other phobias. And if I were to follow that train of thought, this would be a much different paper, but I just figured it's important that I mention that here, that religion is good and it's bad. This is perhaps another way of saying that the focus of my presentation and subsequent chapter will be on the human side of divine-human communication, since we have no way of ascertaining either the existence of God, let alone establishing God as a historical actor. Attention must instead be firmly placed on human actors, actors who are the products of real historical, social, political, and economic contexts, as they either claim to, respond to, or interpret what they imagine to be either their own communication with God or that of others. Ancient Israel. In ancient Israel, divine human communication was primarily achieved in one of two ways: prophecy and sacrifice. Neither, of course, are unique to ancient Israel. Drawing on elements from the age-old and cross-cultural notion of soothsaying and other acts of divination, prophets spoke, and indeed continue to speak, to human communities on behalf of another world, functioning as intermediaries. And I thought the best way to capture this is from the book of Samuel, where the first king of Israel, Saul, seeks to communicate with God on the eve of battle. However, on account of his previous actions that were thought to displease God, or at least thought by David's propagandists to displease God, the channel of communication has been drastically and dramatically closed. Saul then resorts to any means at his disposal, and I quote from 1 Samuel 28, 5-7. The Philistines assembled, they came and camped at Shunem. Saul mustered all Israel and camped at Gilboa. When Saul saw the camp of the Philistines, he was absolutely terrified. So Saul inquired of the Lord, but the Lord did not answer him, not by dreams, nor by Urim, nor by the prophets. So Saul instead instructed his servants, "Find me a woman who is a medium, so that I may go to her and inquire of her." His servants replied to him, "There is a woman who is a medium in Endor." Now this account is revealing because it shows how in ancient Israel there existed several ways to communicate with God. Although prophecy was certainly the most important of these, there also existed, as this passage informs us, other ways such as dream interpretation, talismans, here called Urim, and female diviners, and the so-called symbolized by the so-called witch of Endor, to say nothing of sacred prostitution and other means of communication. Prophets, of course, were not the only institution in which we witness claims to divine human communication. The communication that went on in the temple was considerably different than the one offered by the prophets. In the temple, the priests communicated with God through sacrifice, or korban, to use the Hebrew term. Although sacrifices included bloodless offerings, primarily grain and wine, the most important seemed to have been animal sacrifices. The basic principle behind sacrifice was that one communicated to God by giving up something of one's own property. And we know this from the study of other ancient and modern tribal cultures, to appease the deity, atone for sins, ask for help, and so on. Now, let me move from that to Rabbinic Judaism, which we'll see a rather radical transformation. The destruction of the temple in 70 of the Common Era effectively put an end to these two modes of communication. We now witness, certainly not overnight, the transformation of Judaism from a temple to a book, and from sacrifice, soothsaying, prostitution, and prophecy to the interpretation of that book. New means of divine communication thus had to be explored and ultimately developed. In sacrifice and priestly mediation, if sacrifice and priestly mediation define the religion of ancient Israel, we now encounter unmediated prayer on the part of the individual and by extension the community of which he is a part. And I say he intentionally. This was certainly not a spontaneous outpouring of love or gratitude in the sense, say, of evangelical Christianity, but the development and performance of formulaic prayer at set times, ideally 3 times a day, that in modern tradition has been truncated into 2 because you combine the last 2, ideally in a quorum or minyan of at least 10 men, as it is still done in Orthodoxy to this day. This prayer centered around the Amidah, or the so-called, also called the Shmoneh Esrei, which is the Hebrew for 18, on account of the 18 blessings and benedictions found within it. Communication is still central, but the channels and structure are now different. And through this transformation, we see the tribal God of the ancient Israelites now become sublimated to the level of divine creator, sustainer of the universe, and, for some, the universal God of all peoples. Israel the particular is now tasked with maintaining the cosmic order for all, the universal, through prayer and performance of the divine commandments. Note, though, how the emphasis is turned from prophecy, in which God is perceived to speak to Israel through a prophet, to prayer, where Jews now attempt to communicate with the divine through the fulfillment and proper observation of their religious obligations. A nice illustration of this change may be found in Tractate Bava Metzah 59b from the Babylonian Talmud. I'm not going to bore you with the whole passage, but it is fascinating. And there we read of a situation in which several rabbis get into an argument regarding a specific matter of law. So they decide to bring God into the conversation. So God does, and he sides with one of the rabbis. And as soon as he sides with one of the rabbis, the other rabbis object that God is not following proper jurisprudential procedure, at which point God admits defeat and says, "My children have defeated me." Now, this passage is significant for several reasons. Though God speaks, for instance, his voice is neither more important nor more central to the conversation than that of the rabbis. It is instead a conversation in which God's voice and those of the rabbis are on equal footing with one another. More importantly, however, is the fact that God admits that his children have defeated me. By this, God ostensibly acknowledges that the key to understanding the divine will, that is his will, is not through miracles, not through prophecy, or not through a divine voice that communicates to humans, but through the established processes of halakhic or Jewish legal reasoning, and through the mode of proper interpretation. Such communication, at least according to the normative rabbinic interpretation, occurs through textual study and working out the legal minutiae of the oral Torah. Now, let me talk a little about medieval philosophy. The medieval philosophical tradition and all the Abrahamic religions, I always put Abrahamic in quotation marks because I wrote a book about Abrahamic religions where I tried to show it was a rather dubious and interfaith category and not of much analytic rigor. I didn't win the day. I mean, we still used Abrahamic. I tried. The medieval philosophical tradition in all the Abrahamic religions is, for all intents and purposes, the attempt to synthesize some of the central tenets of Greek philosophy with the demands of monotheism. It is not an easy task, to be sure, as the latter is predicated on the assumption of a God who acts in history through, for example, revelation, creation, and miracles. Greek philosophy, by contrast, denies such involvement and instead posits an aloof deity, if one at all. In all its many manifestations, divine human communication in the medieval philosophical traditions occurred by means of conjunction. The Arabic term is itisal, and the Hebrew term is dveikut. Now, this conjunction is predicated on the idea that both the human intellect and the divine intellect, that is God, engage in similar processes of intellection, even if the former was by definition imperfect. When the human intellect is perfected through the study of philosophy and the various sciences, they take on properties that allow it to resemble, but again to a limited degree, the divine intellect. We see some of the tensions that this creates for a religious worldview at play in the different opinions of Abraham ibn Ezra and Judah Halevi, both from the 12th century, early 12th century. Two thinkers from the so-called golden age of Muslim Spain, or Al-Andalus. However, their understanding of Judaism, and by extension, the nature of divine human communication, could not be more different. Ibn Ezra is often referred to as a Neoplatonist, without getting into the problems of such a term and how it's a modern, often pejorative term, but now has become a school of thought. It is worth noting that it often meant subscribing to the idea that a celestial intellect, i.e. God, an unknowable essence that exists far beyond this world, thinks itself, and in the process produces a cosmic soul, an immaterial a cosmic soul from which individual souls emerge. Each human soul, like for all of us, we thus possess an immaterial entity that subsequently has descended into our body. If the soul is eternal, however, the body is subject to generation and corruption, or birth and death. It is thus up to everyone to protect their soul by trying to keep it away from the passions and emotions of the body, and through engaging in the study of philosophy, broadly defined, including mathematics, biology, physics, etc. Like all Neoplatonists, Ibn Ezra stresses the importance of self-knowledge. He defines the individual as a microcosm. In his commentary to Exodus 31:18, for example, he argues, and here he's using the biblical verse to justify his philosophical interpretation, one cannot know God unless one first knows his own nephesh, neshama, and body, which are mentioned in Exodus. What good is wisdom to him who does not know the essence of his own soul? Through self-knowledge and a proper understanding of the sciences, one begins to grasp God's presence behind everything. This is where he locates divine-human communication. It is a silent communication, to be sure, but one where the individual encounters it in the study of the natural world. Constant observation and contemplation of our world both produces and sustains in the individual a love for God. This in turn leads to the goal of human existence, which is the conjunction with God, i.e. the conjunction of one's own intellect with the divine intellect. I think this came off. There we go. Okay. Okay, so I'm going to leave that. So here we see an tension inherent to this philosophical understanding of Judaism. Are only those who have perfected the various sciences capable of communication with the divine world and with attaining this reabsorption? If so, what is the fate of all those Jewish souls that have not mastered these sciences, but who lead good lives according to the performance of the commandments? Is divine human communication close to them? Moreover, what happens to non-Jewish philosophers? Are they assured of a place in the afterlife and the world to come over non-philosophical Jews? In which case, why have Judaism? Why not just have philosophy? This brings into stark relief the ambiguities inherent to the philosophical understanding of traditional Jewish concepts. Now let me put that in counterpoint with Judah Halevi, who takes an opposite approach and instead locates the genius of Judaism in Jewish peoplehood and its particularity. Though he is certainly familiar with Ibn Ezra's universalizing impulse, he intentionally rejects it. In his well-known dialogue, the Kuzari, he has a rabbi address a king who wants to convert his kingdom to either philosophy or one of the three monotheisms. Repeating the standard argument, Halevi informs the reader that communication with God comes not through the study of philosophy, as the philosophers would have it, but through the performance of the divine commandments that God has given specifically to Israel. Whereas Jewish philosophers stress the intellect as the site of divine human communication, Halevi inverses this, making the bodily performance of the commandments central. And whereas the philosophers style themselves as the spiritual elite of the community, on Halevi's reading, the entire Jewish people becomes the spiritual elite because they are all the recipients of divine revelation. And here he's working on a rabbinic midrash that says that all of Israel, all souls, all Jewish souls were present at the reception of the commandments on Sinai. So breaking sharply with the philosophers then, Halevi argues that religious knowledge does not reside in philosophical speculation, but in the proper observation and performance of the divine commands that God has revealed to the entire Jewish people. The debate between Ibn Ezra and Halevi would seem to center on their rather opposite understandings of Judaism. For Halevi, Judaism is at its most authentic when it turns inward, revealing in its own particularity, and when it is grounded in the uniqueness of a specific people, a specific land, and a specific historical record. For Ibn Ezra, in contrast, Judaism is at its most authentic when it is universal, focused outwards as opposed to inwards, and when the knowledge that Jews possess is, for all intents and purposes, the same as all peoples possess. Now, Maimonides, who's another important towering figure, probably the most important Jewish thinker from the medieval period, sided with Ibn Ezra in this debate, and often others debate. I'm not going to, I've written this down, but I'm not going to. I'm not going to read this because I sort of want to move forward. But so Maimonides would also agree that divine-human communication occurs when the human intellect has become perfected, and through the study of philosophy, and then somehow conjoins the divine intellect. Now, if Halevi was the particularist foil to Ibn Ezra's universalism, classical Kabbalah, or Jewish mysticism, serves the same function to Maimonides' universalism. And one of its most famous texts, as I mentioned yesterday, is the 13th century Sefer HaZohar, which offers an alternative reading of Judaism to the austere ones presented by the likes of Maimonides. If philosophical paradigm stressed silent communication and was based on the texts of the ancient Greeks as mediated by medieval Muslim thinkers, the Kabbalistic paradigm put the individual Jew at the center of a divine drama that was predicated on Jewish sources and internal modes of interpretation. If the philosopher's God was unknowable and was unable to know individuals actualized in matter, the Kabbalistic conception made the individual Jew and his actions, namely the performance of the commandments, directly influence God, who was conceptualized through a 10-member divine pleroma, which I had up on the board yesterday. Now, nowhere is this clear in Lurianic Kabbalah, which draws a series of correspondence between our world here and the upper one. So everything that happens here down below has a counterpart in what happens above. This leads to the radical idea that all human actions are all human actions here ultimately influence the upper world. When an individual Jew performs the commandments or does not, then the upper world is affected. And it is on this level that divine human communication now occurs. The disharmony associated with Adam's sin, both in the material and immaterial worlds, created a disjuncture in the divine world between the male and female elements, which, if you recall from the discussion yesterday, the task for Jews then is to restore the original harmony prior to Adam's sin. And the way they do this is through performance of good deeds down here, which contribute to God's well-being. So the individual Jew thus becomes responsible for God's well-being by restoring all things to their original and primordial condition. Now let me move to this tension in the modern period. The rise of the modern European nation-state brought massive changes to Judaism, transforming it from a way of life into a religion, according to the Western, namely Protestant model. The latter largely conceived of religion as something one did in the home and the place of worship, and not in the street or in the public arena. Jews increasingly faced and subsequently had to answer the Jewish question. This primarily involved ascertaining how and what to change in Judaism to make it compatible with contemporaneous European life and culture, not unlike today's Muslim question. Everything from the rules of kashrut to Sabbath observance to the liturgy came under the microscope as Jews tried to show as Jewish thinkers tried to show modern European nation states that Judaism was compatible with its values. Now, some of the changes we see is that many reformers, soon to give rise to Reform Judaism, sought to modernize Judaism by making it more in sync with contemporaneous non-Jewish religious forms, namely all those things that made Jews and Judaism stick out. So if the performance of the commandments had previously functioned as the vehicle whereby rabbinic Jews and Kabbalists communicated with the divine world, some Jews in the 19th century now imagine the commandments as preventing successful integration. And because of this, the source or the locus of divine communication, human divine communication, had to be sought elsewhere. Following the lead of Immanuel Kant and Jewish thinkers such as Hermann Cohen, these reformers stressed ethics at the expense of metaphysics, and this world at the expense of the one to come. It is from these reformers that we begin to hear of Judaism as ethical monotheism. And following the lead of Hermann Cohen, Jews and Judaism are responsible for introducing this concept to the world. No traditional Jew, it should be noted, would use such language to describe the tradition. But if Judaism, at least Reformed Judaism, located itself in ethical monotheism, then communication with God occurs through a belief in his oneness and through leading an ethical life. The latter, however, did not have to involve following the commandments to the letter of the law, which stressed Jewish particularity, but through leading a universal ethical life grounded in European ideals. Now, for every action, there's a reaction, as we have seen several times already. The changes introduced by Reformed Judaism created a backlash from other Jews who looked on aghast as at the reforms introduced into traditional Judaism. However, it is certainly worth noting that in responding to these changes, even those who remained quote-unquote Torah true, which I'll talk about in a second, even those who now style themselves as traditional or observant, inevitably changed parts of Judaism. They emphasized that through the oral Torah and all the commandments that comprised it, these were all eternal and beyond mutation, so they couldn't be changed. Yet they nevertheless argued that certain changes to Judaism's outward appearance had to be introduced once again to facilitate notions of integration, but not assimilation. These groups eventually gave rise to what we would today call modern orthodoxy. Rather than call themselves ethical monotheists, as Reformed Jews might, modern Orthodox Jews refer to themselves as Torah true Jews, with the word Torah, of course, being used in the widest possible sense and not just to the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible. We thus witness in the differences between Reform and Orthodox Judaisms 2 radically different ideas of divine human communication. If the former locates it in ethical monotheism, which is now often expanded to include notions of social justice, the latter locates it in the obligation that Jews must observe and perform the commandments that God has prescribed to them. The only way to communicate with God for them is to do what Jews have done since time immemorial. Such performance not only connects Orthodox Jews to God, but also to his or her ancestors, namely the entire Jewish people. So let me finish then with an example with much more contemporary and indeed political overtones. Religious Zionism. Now, Zionism, it will be recalled, was or is the attempt to solve the Jewish question through the political process of establishing a national home for the Jews. Whereas other Orthodox leaders had been critical of Zionists for their hubris in going against the traditional notion that one had to wait for the ingathering of the exiles when the Messiah would come, there was a thinker named Rav Kook, who was the first chief Ashkenazic rabbi of Palestine. He argued that secular Zionists were, unknown to them, actually paving the way for messianic redemption. He maintained the modern movement to reestablish a Jewish state in the land of Israel was a theological watershed moment, and that Zionists, and here he drew upon categories from both Halevi and the Kabbalists, were not autonomous agents, but part of a divine plan that would usher in messianic redemption. Subsequent religious Zionists took up several of Rav Kook's ideas, centering their movement around the 3 key pillars of land, people, and Torah. These 3 pillars, it will be recalled, form the epicenter of the concept of divine human communication in Judaism. What religious Zionists add to this mix, however, is the political process. We see this clearly in Rav Kook's son, Zvi Yehuda Kook, who went even further than his father and argued that the age of redemption had already arrived through the Zionist movement, and that this age needed to be furthered by the extension of Jewish rule over the land occupied by Israel in the Six-Day War, 1967. Something that would include, or was just used to justify, the construction of settlements in what had previously been Arab lands. Since Jews form the core of humanity as the recipients of divine communication, as the only recipients of divine human communication according to this worldview, he argued that Israel represents the soul of the world, while other nations represent the body. And of course, if you think back to Maimonides and the Neoplatonists, the body is subject to generation and corruption, whereas the soul is eternal. It was thus up to Israel, so the reasoning goes, to elevate humanity, to lift it up. Now, in this vision, it was quite easy to cast non-Jews, read Arabs, as a pollutant on the land, one that must be removed by any means possible, from expulsion to murder. While this vision is by no means shared by all Zionists, especially secular political Zionists, we see quite clearly in the former how the idea of divine communication, when given a political angle, can have nefarious consequences. We see this in religious Zionist political parties, such as the Gush Emunim, or the Bloc of the Faithful, and the National Religious Party, before the latter merged into contemporary political parties that exist in Israel today, such as HaBeit HaYehudi, or the Jewish Home, or HaYikud HaLeumi, National Union. Now, let me just conclude briefly. I ended with the political dimensions of divine human communication, not so much because I think that this somehow represents the telos of that which we witnessed in the Bible, but to show how the concept can be used in the contemporary world in ways that go far beyond what we might call religious or theological. This, it seems to me, opens up an important avenue, one in conversation with what has now become known as critical religion, that seeks to show how the category religion is always interconnected and brought into existence through other categories, such as the social, the political, or ideology. In this respect, the concept of divine communication can be used to justify or legitimate any number of claims that we might well call political. We see this clearly in the rise of religious Zionism that takes the concept of this communication and then uses it to show the superiority of a particular people and a particular land over all others. This concept can then be used to justify annexation, expulsion, and occupation. Now defined as a trope, divine human communication can be manipulated in all sorts of ways, from the high-minded to what we might call the nefarious or the low-minded. Relatedly, when compared to the other two Abrahamic religions, the concept of divine human communication takes on a very particularistic dimension in Judaism, at least within certain strains of the tradition. While the rationalist tradition tried to connect the concept of communication to Aristotelian philosophy and Kantian ethics, among others, it by no means carried the day, or perhaps better, certainly does not represent normative Judaism. Rather than use the concept of communication inclusively, much theological speculation in Judaism has done so exclusively. Mysticism, which in the other traditions is often universal in intent and scope, in Judaism represents the tradition at its most particularistic, if not actually xenophobic. The three traditions thus need to be examined in counterpoint with one another. To examine only one makes the features examined appear as unique or idiosyncratic. The moment we put them into counterpoint, we begin to see patterns emerge to move our analysis forward. It is important to do this, however, not just phenomenologically, and by saying that they all represent different manifestations of the same essence. On the contrary, we can only do this by appreciating each tradition in its own historical and social context. Similarities are not essential, in other words, but contingent. Thank you.